The Bigfoot War of Laflore County. The flickering glow of the low-burning fire cast wavering shadows across the study's walls, transforming the room into a shifting tapestry of light and darkness that seemed alive itself. I sat hunched over my cluttered desk, surrounded by maps, faded notes, and fragments of history, each piece a puzzle waiting to be assembled. The scent of aged paper and wood smoke mingled in the air. Nearby, Sarah sat cross-legged, her brow furrowed as she sifted through a pile of documents, her fingers moving with methodical precision and her sharp eyes scanning every line. Her closest friend, Marcus, an older historian and former soldier, leaned against the bookshelf, arms crossed, watching intently. Marcus had spent decades studying Native American history and folklore, his knowledge deep and well-worn, like the leather-bound journals he kept.
"Anything new catch your eye?"
Sarah asked, glancing up briefly, her voice gentle but inquisitive. "Actually, I've been thinking about something. Have you ever heard of the Bigfoot War of 1855? I responded, voice hushed as if sharing a secret. "It's a story woven into the fabric of the Choctaw Nation's history, something monstrous, something feral, haunting their land and shaping their fate in ways most people never knew." Marcus nodded slowly, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "I've read a few accounts in old journals, stories passed down through generations. The idea of a creature that moves between worlds, feeding on chaos, aligns with many legends of the land. But a war, that's a different layer altogether." Sarah looked at him, curiosity flickering.
"So, you think there's truth behind these stories?"
Marcus chuckled softly. "In history, truth is often layered with myth. But what's important is what they tell us about the fears, the resilience, and the spirit of those people. This story of the Bigfoot War, whether entirely factual or not, captures something vital about their struggle to survive against forces unseen and terrifying." I nodded, feeling the weight of their words. "Exactly. It's about brave warriors facing grotesque, almost supernatural beasts in the wilds of Oklahoma, a primal clash, human courage against ancient fury. And I believe the story holds truths beyond what the eye can see." Sarah looked back at her papers, then at Marcus. "Maybe it's time we listen more closely to stories like these, even if they seem unbelievable, because sometimes they contain the echoes of something real." I reached for a detailed map of the southeastern United States, where the Choctaw once thrived before tragedy tore through their homeland. The Choctaw people were fierce, resilient, and deeply connected to this land. From childhood, they learned to hunt, track, and fight, skills passed down through countless generations. Their bodies were sinewy, muscles rippling beneath dark, sun-kissed skin. They weren't just warriors. They were born to survive in the toughest terrains, molded by the land itself. She tilted her head, eyes bright.
"What kind of physical standards did they set for a warrior?"
Most of them stood between 5'10" and 6 feet tall, imposing figures built for endurance and strength, I explained. Their eyes burned with spirited energy, and their faces bore signs of a hard life, scarred, weathered, yet fierce. They trained relentlessly, pushing their endurance beyond normal limits, running through dense forests, climbing rugged cliffs, fighting off enemies, honing their senses for tracking and combat, I added, my voice full of admiration. They were soldier hunters, born to navigate the wilderness as seamlessly as they moved through their own skin. She nodded, her eyes shining with awe.
"Must have been terrifying to face those kinds of warriors."
"Fearless, yes," I said softly. "But the 1830s brought upheaval, the Indian Removal Act, which forcibly displaced them from their ancestral lands. They endured the trail of tears, hundreds perishing from disease, starvation, exhaustion. It was a wrenching, brutal migration, leaving behind everything they knew and loved, their spirits battered but unbroken. Her face darkened with empathy.
That's heartbreaking. No wonder they fought so fiercely to hold on to what little they had left.
Exactly, I agreed. Despite everything, they persisted, maintaining their identity amid chaos and loss. But then came a new threat, something even their toughest warriors hadn't prepared for. She sat up straighter, her voice tense. I rolled out the map again, pointing to Laflore County, Oklahoma. This is where our story unfolds, 1855. After settling here, the Choctaw struggled to establish stability in a landscape that seemed increasingly hostile. They built homes, formed councils, tried to carve out a new life. But the land itself appeared to resist, as if it harbored secrets deeper than they could imagine. Her eyes widened.
What was going on in the territory?
Settlers encroached relentlessly, claiming land, pushing into territories that the Choctaw still considered sacred. But what truly terrorized them were the raids, livestock stolen in the dead of night, crops trampled, children snatched without a trace, leaving nothing behind but terror and despair. The community was gripped with mounting fear, suspicion fueling paranoia.
That's horrible. Did they have any idea who was responsible?
They suspected rogue settlers, but there was no concrete proof, I said slowly, and the more they investigated, the darker the truth became. The real culprit was something far more sinister, an entity known as the Hatak Lusa Cheeto, a man-beast that moved between worlds, slipping from the physical realm into the spiritual, unseen yet always present. It watched from the shadows, feeding on chaos, disdainful of humans, thriving on their fear. Her brow furrowed deeply.
A monster that can move between worlds? That's terrifying.
I painted the scene vividly in her mind. Imagine the dawn breaking over the woods. The warriors gathered. Painted faces, tribal symbols etched into their skin. Leather armor scarred from countless battles. They carried bows, spears, machetes, tools of survival, sharpened by necessity and battle-hardened by experience. Their muscles were taut with readiness, eyes burning with resolve. They knew what was at stake, their very existence.
Did they train for this specific fight?
Absolutely, I said. Day after day they practiced tracking, ambush tactics, close quarters combat. They knew every inch of the terrain, the hiding spots, the trees, the shadows, as if it was part of their own flesh. Joshua Laflore himself was a towering figure, broad-shouldered, tall, with a commanding presence that made even the bravest warriors listen when he spoke. Scouts were sent by Laflore to track these entities that plagued them, as the two skilled trackers cleared thick brush. The woods grew eerily silent as they pressed forward. The usual chorus of birds and insects faded into an oppressive hush, an unnatural stillness that pressed against the skin, the kind of silence that screams danger. One scout, trembling, whispered, "Something's wrong," clutching his spear tightly, scanning the shadows for movement. They arrived at a clearing, and what they saw froze them in place, I said softly. The ground was littered with the remains of women and children, twisted, mangled, as if torn apart by savage primal rage. The air reeked of death, sickeningly heavy, thick with decay. And amidst this horror, three enormous, hairy figures crouched over the feast, their glowing eyes fixed upon the intruders with malevolent intelligence. The scouts hastily retreated in fear as the creature's posture became aggressive. Her voice quivered.
What did these creatures look like?
They were monstrous, covered in wild, tangled fur that looked like it had never been brushed, wild and matted. Nearly 8 feet tall, muscles carved by primal survival. Their eyes shimmered with cunning, dangerous and intelligent. Long, sinewy limbs moved with deadly precision. Their claws, their fangs, razor-sharp, Capable of tearing flesh in an instant, they radiated raw, savage power. Did they have supernatural abilities? Yes. They could melt into the shadows, becoming nearly invisible. Their growls and roars sounded like the land itself was speaking, a language of primal fury that reverberated deep in the bones of the forest. They commanded the very elements, trees, wind, earth, drawing on the land's ancient magic to conceal themselves, to strike from unseen places. Laflore's face hardened as he listened to the scouts' disturbing encounter. Laflore looked off into the distance and studied the land. He realized they couldn't sit and wait for them to strike again. They had to act, so he and his strongest warriors formed the Light Horsemen, elite fighters drawn from the best of the Choctaw. They prepared for war, knowing they faced something beyond ordinary enemies, something that defied all understanding. Joshua Laflore, born in the year 1800, was the principal chief of the Choctaw Nation. He was a wealthy and influential figure. He was a mixed race, French and Choctaw. Even though he was a wealthy man and half-blood, he was respected by the Choctaw and admired for his fearless resolve and strategic acumen. As Laflore and his men pressed into the darkest part of the forest, the scouts lead them to the horrific location. The unmistakable stench of death filled the air, heavy and rancid, compelling them to press forward. Fueled by resolve and fury, witnessing the brutality committed against his people firsthand, Joshua rallied his men. The atmosphere growing heavier, large shadows began to form in the tree line ahead. Brandishing his sword as he charged toward the monstrous creatures. For our people, for our homes. His sword flashed, swinging at the nearest beast, but the creature's thick hide was almost impenetrable, barely a scratch. It snarled, a guttural, deafening sound that shook the leaves and rattled the bones of those nearby. A second beast lunged from the shadows, massive claws raking across Joshua's chest, knocking him to the ground. Gasping for breath, he fought to stay conscious. The warriors shouted, "No, we won't let this beast win," their voices fierce, desperate, echoing through the trees. They surged around him, axes and spears raised high, fighting back with everything they had. They responded with brutal efficiency, I said grimly. Old rifles, clunky but deadly, fired into the thick fur. Thunder rolled through the woods, bullets tearing flesh and fur. "For our families," the Choctaw warriors roared, eyes blazing with fury and grief. They kept firing, kept fighting, trying to drive the monsters back.
Did they succeed?
Some of the creatures staggered, finally falling under the relentless barrage. But the fight was savage, gruesome. In the chaos, Joshua was vulnerable. The largest, smartest beast, more cunning than the others, leapt onto him, jaws opening wide. Its razor-sharp fangs sank into his head, cracking skull, tearing flesh. With a sickening crunch, it ripped his head clean off, leaving the battlefield soaked in blood and despair, a scene of utter chaos and loss. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears threatening.
No, Joshua.
Grief turned into rage, pouring every ounce of strength into their assault. "For Joshua!" they shouted, their voices echoing through the woods. They fought like desperate animals, trying to end this nightmare, fighting not just for revenge but for survival itself. The remaining warriors, battered and bloodied, fought with every ounce of strength they could muster. Their shouts, raw with grief and rage, echoed through the silent woods as they pressed forward, blades flashing and arrows piercing the shadows. Every breath was labored, every movement driven by a desperate hope to end the nightmare and avenge their fallen leader. As the chaos continued in the distance, stood a being seemingly connected to the Choctaw and these beasts in an ethereal way. From the darkness I watched, an unseen guardian, my gaze fixed upon the savage ballet of life and death unfolding before me. The forest trembled at the clash of primal forces, ancient and relentless. The scent of blood, earth, and fear thickened the air, heavy with the weight of centuries of struggle. The voice of the land itself seemed to murmur in the shadows, ancient and deep, whispering truths lost to time. It spoke of resilience and the fragile balance between worlds, unseen yet always present. The beast's dark eyes, glowing with feral intelligence, traced every movement, every cry. As the battle raged on, the beast's voice, deep, guttural, resonant, seemed to echo within the very marrow of the land, a primal language older than memory. Its growls and roars sounded like the earth itself crying out in fury, commanding the shadows and the trees to conceal it, to strike unseen. It was a creature born of chaos, thriving on the fear and violence that stained the ground. Yet even as bullets found their mark, a primal, almost supernatural power seemed to fill the air. The creature, wounded but unbowed, roared, shaking leaves and cracking branches. Its eyes burned with savage intelligence and a fury that refused to die. Finally staggered, weakened but still dangerous, the warriors pressed forward, relentless. They fought with a desperation that transcended fear, driven by the spirit of Joshua and the hope of survival. One by one, the beast's mighty form was struck down, collapsing into a heap of fur and broken bones. As several beasts where slayed the remaining few retreated into the shadows of the forest, the air grew still, thick with the scent of victory and loss. The warriors, bloodied and exhausted, stood amidst the carnage, silent in their grief, their hearts heavy with the cost of their fight. They mourned their leader, their spirits battered but unbroken. Some knelt, offering prayers to the spirits of the land and their ancestors, seeking strength to carry on. The land itself seemed to mourn with them, its ancient heartbeat heavy with sorrow. The night stretched long and dark, but beneath the grief, a fragile hope stirred. Faint, but persistent. The warriors would need time to heal, both physically and spiritually. They would rebuild, and their spirits would endure. They would remember Joshua's courage and learn from the darkness that had threatened to consume them. The land, the people, and even the shadows knew. This was only the beginning. Out of loss, new strength would grow. Out of despair, hope would rise again. And in the quiet, I, an unseen guardian, remained quietly watching, patiently waiting. For I knew that peace was more than the absence of war. It was a fragile seed planted in the hearts of all who dared to face the darkness. The land and its defenders had faced their shadow, and now they would forge a new path. One of understanding, resilience, and perhaps, someday, harmony. The fire's embers dimmed, shadows lengthening into night, but the story, the enduring story of struggle and hope, continued on, written in the silent language of the land itself. Weeks later, sitting on the porch under a blanket of stars, Sarah and Marcus discussed the story that had ignited their curiosity. The fire crackled softly as Marcus sipped his coffee, eyes reflecting the night. "You know," Marcus said quietly, "stories like the Bigfoot War remind us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the spirit of a people, their fears, their hopes, their fight to keep their stories alive. Whether myth or truth, these legends serve as a bridge to understanding their resilience." Sarah nodded, a thoughtful smile on her face.
It makes me wonder what stories we're dismissing today, what truths lie hidden behind the legends we overlook. Maybe someday, future generations will look back and see our stories as echoes of something deeper.
Marcus looked at her, a gentle smile touching his lips. Exactly. And like those warriors, whether real or myth, we must keep listening. Because sometimes what's most important isn't what's proven, but what's remembered, what we choose to carry forward. Sarah gazed at the stars, her mind alive with new questions.
Maybe our stories too are part of the land's ancient song, waiting to be heard, understood, and honored.
And in that quiet night, amid the glow of the dying fire, they understood that stories, like the land itself, are eternal, waiting for those willing to listen.